This is you, a nurse on a psych ward. You're about to deliver meds to a beloved patient when all of a sudden you realize you're not alone. Someone is standing behind you. Thankfully, this person meant no harm and was just curious what you were doing. But it could have been someone else, or someone else, or someone else. Had you been aware of your surroundings, you would have known someone crept in behind you as you entered this patient's room. You lucked out this time, but next time you might not be so fortunate. Hey, in this video we're going to talk about how to be safe while working on a psych ward. My name's Nick. I'm a psych nurse. I've been a psych nurse for over 5 years now. I've worked in forensics, civil, outpatient, inpatient with people going through withdrawals, and I have yet to be assaulted. Okay, that's a lie. I have been assaulted. At the very end of this video, I'll talk about the assault. I'll also share with you just some other information I think can keep you safe on the psych ward. But without further ado, let's get into our 9 ways to stay safe on a psych ward. So the first way we're going to stay safe while working in a psych ward is we're going to be respectful of our patients. I feel like this goes without saying, but I've just seen so many staff put themselves in potentially compromising positions because they aren't treating their patients with respect. Your patients are your allies. You're there to serve them. You're their advocate. The last thing you want to do is give them a reason to assault you or to be upset with you. And so anytime we're redirecting a patient, anytime we're making a request, we're always doing it in the most tactful manner possible. Remember that often when we're working in a psych ward, we're interacting with patients who have lost touch with reality. So when we're working with these patients, we want to be as direct and clear and concise as possible while being very tactful and polite. And this brings me to my second way to stay safe while working in a psych ward, and that is to set appropriate and professional boundaries in a very respectful way. What I mean by that is if a patient continually violates your boundaries, and I'm not talking about huge violations here, it could just be a personal space boundary. Lots of patients have issues with personal space. They're not sure exactly like where to stand in relation to a staff member. So that's where you need to provide them that guidance and say, hey, look, you know, my bubble's here. I would appreciate if you would just stand, give me like 2 feet of space while we're talking. I want to hear your story. It's just you're standing a little too close. And I feel a little uncomfortable when you're that close. Like that would be a way that I would set a boundary if personal space was an issue to me. But if you're someone who doesn't set those boundaries, or you're not comfortable setting those boundaries, you're going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to rub off on the patients, and you got to figure out a way to do it tactfully. Another example I'll give is this is pretty common. You have a patient who just likes to use a very loud voice in the day hall. They're disrupting other patients by doing so. So rather than being like, hey, you need to quiet down or whatever, or use that loud voice in your room or whatever, just to go up to, I would walk up to them. We're not shouting at them across the room because that would be hypocritical. And I'd say, hey, John, I notice you use a pretty loud voice while you're in the day hall. Can you do me a favor and just lower your voice? This is just a communal environment. We got a lot of other people here. We just want to use a quiet voice. Is that cool? And usually they're going to say yes, no issues. Then, and what's often going to happen is this person's going to breach the boundary either willfully or unintentionally, and you need to again set the boundary. So you walk up to that patient and say, hey, John, you remember the last time you used a voice loud in the day hall? Tell me about what our conversation was about. And then you just check their memory. And you know what? That's the way to do it. You don't go up and say, hey, we talked about this last time. You need to stay quiet in the day hall. You approach the situation. You explore it as a nurse, like what's going on here? Because sometimes, and I found that I thought it was behavioral, and then actually when you do explore it with them, you're like, oh no, they have a valid reason for why they forgot about using a loud voice or whatever, or whatever boundary it is that you're setting or you're reminding them of. They legitimately forgot about it. So when a patient violates a boundary, the way you are going to maintain that boundary is you're going to have an open-ended conversation about it with them and just keep talking with them, and then hopefully it clicks. And by the way, I've really never had this technique not work as long as you just explore it and you do it in a genuine way without giving them these rhetorical questions that seem disingenuous. Just be very genuine, like, hey, the last time we had that conversation, tell me about what you remember from our conversation, something like that. All right, I don't think I need to belabor this anymore. The third way you can be safe while working in a psych ward is to just imagine the worst possible situation that might occur and then what you're going to do in that situation. And trust me, while working in psych, you'll have downtime to do this. You'll just kind of think of various scenarios, or a patient might be behaving a certain way and you're like, okay, what if they all of a sudden do this? What am I going to do? So here's an example. Let's say you're just sitting there, it's quiet, you're just watching the day hall. All of a sudden, and let's just say you work on a unit that has like multiple hallways. And when you're down one hallway, you don't necessarily know what's going on down the other hallways. Well, let's pretend you're sitting there, it's quiet, all of a sudden you hear a patient just scream down the hall. You're going to go run down there and check, and maybe all staff is going to go down there. They're going to go to the source of the sound, right? It's just this person screaming. You're like, what is going on? Well, then while this person's screaming, it turns out it's just a diversion, and maybe down another hallway you have a patient assaulting another patient. So then you can think to yourself, okay, if I go down this hallway to check on the person that's screaming, I always need to make sure I've got someone else monitoring the day all over here. A fourth way to maintain safety while working in a psych ward, and I hate to say this, but it's actually to review the policies and procedures that wherever you're working has established. No one likes to write policy and procedure, so if there's a policy and procedure, it's probably written for a reason. And the reality is policy and procedure has a lot more experience than any of us do, and so we can heed its advice. It's been there for years, right? And every once in a blue moon, something bizarre will happen in a psychiatric hospital that requires the administration to reevaluate their policies and procedures and maybe rewrite them. And that's why if you're familiar with them, you can be like, oh, I wonder why this is a bizarre policy. Why would they have it? Why would they write it like this? Why does it say something like this? And then you think about it, you're like, okay, I could see maybe in this situation, a patient might do this might happen. You're like, okay, that's why they have that policy and procedure. And the truth of the matter is sometimes policies and procedures are a little overly rigorous in my opinion, but at the same time, if you have kind of a working understanding of the big stuff of policy and procedure, it's going to help you stay safe on a psych ward. When I worked at the state hospital, one of the policies they had is anytime a patient was restrained, within 5 minutes, a nurse needed to come and take their vitals. Probably pretty easy for us to understand why that was a policy, but I guarantee like 50 years ago, maybe before this was written or whatever, I'm sure there was instances where people were restrained and vitals were never taken and the patient suffered or had a heart attack or couldn't breathe and died or whatever. Our fifth way to stay safe while working on a psych ward is if you're feeling unsafe or unsure about something, ask some regular staff what they would do in this situation. The reality is when you come on as a new grad or as a new employee to a psych ward, there's probably a lot of people who've worked there years who are very familiar with what you should do in a certain situation. In fact, even when I used to work float pool and I'd go on to a new unit and something would happen, I was just like, well, I'm not entirely sure how to handle this. I would just ask staff there and say, hey, given the situation, what do you think another nurse would do in this situation? And they would usually say, well, usually when this happens, this is what happens. And I'm like, okay, cool, that makes sense. Along a similar vein, let's say you are working on a new unit, you got meds delivered to somebody and they're very unstable, you don't feel safe about it, and you're like, what else should I do to keep myself safe? You can just be like, hey, I'm about to deliver meds to Rebecca over there, but she's scaring the shit out of me. Like, what do you recommend I do to keep myself safe in this situation? They'll probably be like, oh, well, let's call security, I'll come with you, yada, 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 and you'll have some backup. Number 6 about staying safe in a psych ward, and this one's probably one of the most important, is just trust your gut. No matter what, just trust your intuition. If you are in a situation and the hair starts to stand on your body and you're feeling just nervous and you're like, this doesn't feel right, leave the situation. Come up with any silly excuse for why you go, I gotta go, I'm feeling sick, I'm about to have diarrhea, I'm gonna leave. Like if you're in just any dicey situation with your patients or the conversations become super uncomfortable or whatever, and you're just like, man, this feels very awkward, just come up with an abrupt way to leave the conversation that sounds plausible. After you've removed yourself from the situation, you feel safe, then you can kind of assess like what's going on, what you need to do you need to notify other staff, and you can develop a plan for this situation. There were a few times when I worked at the state hospital on our admission unit when we had some psychopaths that I worked with where I felt my safety was a little jeopardized. And I remember talking to this one individual in particular, and he had charges of murder. The guy's charges was shooting another person in the back of the head. He didn't even know him. I mean, this guy had very profound psychopathy. And as I'm talking to him and I'm around some other patients, I just get this feeling almost like I was gonna be jumped. It was a very bizarre situation. So I just remember thinking to myself, okay, and I didn't actually leave the situation, which I probably should have, but I just remember thinking, okay, if this happens, this is what I'm gonna do. And I had a plan of escape, which you should always have like a plan A, a plan B, a plan C when you're in kind of a dicey situation. I guess I'm sharing that story because my gut in that situation was like on fire. I'm like, bro, this does not feel right. Like something is about to happen. Luckily, nothing did happen, but I was ready. 7th way to stay safe on a psych ward, we already kind of touched about this, is just always bring additional personnel. If you're going to deliver meds and be inside of a patient's room and you don't feel comfortable down there, you don't trust the patient, just always make sure to bring other people. It almost will never hurt to bring someone else with you. Sometimes you're going to interact with patients who like to make false accusations. And one of the last things you want is when it's an accusation that you are the only witness there and it's your word versus their word. Oftentimes, your word's going to be taken over a psychotic patient, but nevertheless, it's always good to have a witness. So if you're going to interact with a patient where like maybe you're going to go back to their room for whatever reason, or you've got to do a room check or something, and that patient is in their room, I usually just tell my coworker like, hey, I'm going to go check Rebecca's room. Do you mind just coming down with me and just standing outside while I do that? Way number 8 on how to stay safe while working in a psych ward is make sure you know where your panic alarms are. Make sure you know how to bring additional help if you need it as soon as possible without having to panic and be like, oh my God, I know there's a button I should be pushing somewhere, or there's a number I should be calling, because trust me, when you're in that kind of fight or flight mode, your brain ain't going to be working that well. So you really want to know where your panic alarms are. Along a similar vein, just familiarizing yourself with the unit layout, like where stuff is, where you can go if you need to feel safe, where are some of the more dangerous places on the unit, stuff like that. All right, and my last way to stay safe while working on a psych ward ward is the reality is you're just going to find some situations where you can't really prepare for what's going to happen. Like there's just bizarre stuff that happens in a psych ward that's not necessarily emergent or emergency-ish. It's just bizarre, but it definitely needs your attention. And you may not entirely be sure of what to do. So I would just like to remind everybody out there, first and foremost, you're an advocate for the patient. So you got to keep everybody safe, including staff, including other patients, but you're there for the patient. So whatever goes down, you just always want to be asking yourself, okay, is what's going down right now, is it in the best interest of the patient? And if it's not, what can I do to change it so that it at least is getting closer to the best interest of the patient, or at least so I can justify my actions as being in the best interest of the patient? So if you're ever confused, you're like, man, I don't know what to do here. You just got to kind of ask yourself, okay, well, what really is in the best interest of the patient, or what do I think is in the best interest of the patient? And let that mindset sort of guide your interventions as an employee, as someone who's working on a psych ward. I hope you found those reasons helpful. And here's some other stuff I want to share with you. I want to talk about the time I got assaulted. And I also want to mention that, you know, when you're working on a psych ward, make sure you stay in shape. Like do some calisthenics here. I do some push-ups every day, some pull-ups every day. I try to stay active. I work out, I shoot hoops. I do a bunch of different stuff so that I feel like I can depend and trust my body when I need to trust it. I feel like if I was not in at least the decent shape that I am in now, it would greatly affect the way that I feel while working on the unit. I wouldn't feel as safe. I feel like I can handle myself more or less physically if I need to in a situation. But if I didn't feel that way, I guarantee you that would increase my anxiety, which is going to rub off on my patient care. Okay, now I want to share with you the time that and I'm laughing because this was like a totally foreseeable event when I got assaulted, and I kind of knew it was going to happen, but just like, I guess you could say curiosity killed the cat on this one. So here's how I got assaulted while working at a state hospital. So we had this patient. This guy was an elderly man, very frail. He had been on I shouldn't say very frail. It wasn't like super frail, just like emaciated, very skinny, but he could move around and was kind of quick for his age, I guess. But he had been on a unit where he was in locked confinement for years because of what they called, I think it was like injurious, intractable behavior. That kind of behavior, it's very assaultive, very hostile, very unpredictable, would all of a sudden just turn on people in an instant. And so eventually the hospital did away with this unit, which I think was actually a very good thing because these guys were just almost like in solitary confinement and they were being checked on every 15 minutes, but it was like a locked prison cell. And they didn't get fresh air, believe it or not. When they came out of their cell, they walked down this hall. We would chain them up while they ate their food, and then we would bring them back to this locked door seclusion room. This was security that was doing it, not the nurses. You were just there to take vitals, make sure they took their meds, stuff like that. But other than that, it was always security that was handling and interacting with these patients more or less. But they did not get the light of day, right? So this guy had come from that very restrictive setting. But oftentimes when I worked that unit, I was like, I don't know if these guys really need it or not. I wanted to test the boundaries. Like let them out in the day hall with just some staff and just like see what they do. But anyhow, that's going off on a tangent. So this guy, eventually they did away with this ward. Each of these patients got distributed to kind of the various units around the forensic state hospital. And so we've been working with this guy for some time. And the reality is like, after you worked with him for some time, you could kind of get a feel for when he might all of a sudden act out. I mean, you could have very good rapport with him. You'd have a decent amount of insight. He'd be like, I can't stand these meds. They're making me feel this way. And all you guys are doing is you're locking me in this hospital. I'm not getting better. I've been here for years, yada, yada, yada. And then later in the day, it's like he'd have these kind of, his psychosis was sort of up and down, but it's like he lost touch of reality and he got this look in his eyes. Like if you've ever played with a dog, and when you like rally up a dog and it gets that kind of crazy look, like the pupils get very dilated and they have that like crazy look and you're like, okay, like you need to calm down, dog. You're getting a little too excited. That's sort of the look he would get. Like you could just tell. And one time my 30-minute time frame ran out on my camera. So I kind of lost track of where I was. So at the state hospital though, there was this back room and every day we would take patients back there. We would listen to their bowel sounds, take their vitals. And once in a blue moon, I shouldn't say once in a blue moon, it was probably like once every 2 weeks. I'd bring this patient back. We'll call him Mark. I'd bring Mark back to this room. I'd take his vitals. He was on clozapine too, so he was getting weekly blood draws, vitals frequently, and he was always upset about being on the medication. So I'd take him back, listen to his bowel sounds if he allowed me to. Usually he would refuse. Take his vitals, which he would usually let me take, and then sometimes he would just stand up and then he'd square off with me. And the crazy thing about this room is like he's standing right where the exit was, right? Like he'd be like, "Come on, motherfucker, you want to fight me? Let's go!" And like just out of nowhere, would just flip. And I don't really know what would trigger that kind of behavior, but you could kind of get get a sense of where he was at. So I would get in my defensive stance, you know, I'm like we're both just kind of squaring off. I'm like, you need to leave this room. I would just kind of use a loud voice, and eventually he would, and other staff would come and they would kind of redirect him. And that's the thing, is like when he got focused on you couldn't de-escalate him, but someone else could come in and talk him down. Likewise, if he got focused on someone else, I would be able to walk in and de-escalate them, but that person that he was focused on couldn't de-escalate. So anyhow, in this particular situation, the time I got assaulted, I believe he was sitting down, or he may have been in his room. My memory of exactly where I think he was in his room, and I think I had just given him his medication. Like I had to kind of cajole him to taking his meds, had to call security. I'd given his meds, he left, and then he was like, hey, I want to tell you something. Come here. And I'm kind of thinking, okay, he's just like calling me over so he can try to smack me. He's an older man, but I was like, all right, I'll just like come a little closer, but I'll keep my distance. Well, he's like, hey, Nick. He's like, come here. I got something I want to tell you. And just the look in his eyes, like he seemed a little devious to me. And I was like, okay, Mike, what are you going to do? Like, you're probably going to try to swing on me or something. So I come a little closer, and then he takes like a step forward, and then he kicks me in the leg. And it wasn't like a super hard kick. Like the guy's frail. He probably weighed, I don't know, 90 pounds. And I just like left, and it wasn't a big deal. I'm not going to like scream or anything like that, or he doesn't need to be restrained, nothing like that. It's just like one of those things where I put myself willingly kind of in a compromising situation because I was curious to see what was going to happen. But the reality is the assault completely could have been avoided. And when I hear about assaults, oftentimes when you look back on them, when it's a patient assaulting a staff member, there are absolutely things staff could have done to keep themselves safe. I worked with a close buddy at the state hospital up in another city, and he got headbutted by a patient right here in his nose. And I can't remember if his nose broke or whatever, but it bled a lot. And then when you hear him recount the story, you're like, bro, what were you doing? Like hugging the patient, getting that close to him. And there's nothing wrong with hugging patients. You have to do it discretionarily, right? But this particular patient was floridly psychotic, and sometimes he'd have these like bouts of psychosis where he was very happy, and other times he'd have these bouts of psychosis when he was very pissed. But either way, given that kind of lability, why would you ever want to hug a patient like that? And this dude I work with, I mean, he's a little out there, and I get it. Physical contact is very important for people's well-being, but in this situation, I think it was entirely inappropriate, and he paid the price for that. So yeah, and I think we'll shut it off there. It seems like this might be kind of a long video, so hopefully you found it helpful.